Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian, and today I'm looking at a very cool Italian prototype pistol. This is called a Sosso, S-O-S-S-O, named after its inventor, Giulio Sosso. I'm hopefully pronouncing that sort of in the right, close to being right. At any rate, Giulio developed this design in the early 1930s, 1934 specifically, and then it took him a little while to actually find someone to manufacture the guns for him. He took out patents on this design in Italy. We know he also had a patent on it in the UK in 1937, and probably in a couple other countries. And there are a number, well, the locking mechanism is very complicated and strange, and the magazine is what really makes this gun cool. Now, this is the final version. This is what's called a model of 1941, and these were manufactured by FNA in Brescia in 1942, or at least they were proofed in 1942. What's interesting is there were a number of 2 or maybe 3 earlier versions of this pistol, developmental variants, before it actually got into, well, as close as it got to mass production in Brescia. So of this, the final version, the model of 1941 Sosso pistol, there were only 5 examples that were actually made. The first 4 went to high-ranking people. Number 1 went to King Emmanuel of Italy. Number 2 actually went to Benito Mussolini. Number 3 went to the Field Marshal of the Army. Number 4 went to the Grand Admiral of the Navy. And then there's number 5, which is this gun. It's kind of interesting. This one is serial numbered 0, but it's the 5th of the guns. There were 5, 1 through 4, and this one, number 0. So all 5 of them were fitted with a slot for a shoulder stock holster. So the idea of the shoulder stock was that it gave you a third point of contact with the gun. So in addition to the 2 hands, obviously on the pistol, you've also got a shoulder and cheek weld on the gun, which allows you to hold it more steadily, and it really does make the gun more accurate, more precise, especially for long-range shooting. As a result, this does have an adjustable long-range sight on it, which you'll often find on the shoulder-stocked pistols. This fell out of favor for a couple of reasons. It's a legit advantage and improvement to the gun, but it's not one that people take advantage of very often. And it was an expensive thing. As a shoulder stock, this is pretty fragile and not very good. As a holster, it's complex and it's got metal bits sticking out of it. So it kind of makes a mediocre stock and a mediocre holster in exchange for this accuracy benefit that you're not going to use very often. So most militaries, by the mid-1930s, were getting rid of this idea. They didn't bother with shoulder stocks on pistols, and they just gave you a very effective sort of basic holster. In the US, of course, the National Firearms Act of 1934 classified this type of system as a short-barreled rifle, which then is subject to registration and tax stamps, and it made it impractical for people to want to deal with. I will point out that most of these guns that were originally designed with shoulder stocks from the 30s and before are exempted from the National Firearms Act in the US. They're called out specifically by name, and this one among them. So that's why you can do this legally with older guns that were originally manufactured with these stocks. The Sosso was in 9mm Parabellum, and like I said, the magazine is really the most interesting part of this gun. This has an unusually curved magazine, and it doesn't have a spring and follower. It has a 21 round capacity chain inside it. So let me bring the camera back here. Let's take a closer look at this very unusual magazine, and we'll take the pistol apart while we're at it. So first off, this pistol is huge. Really big, bulky pistol. It is a locked breech 9mm, but by 1941 there were much smaller locked breech 9mm pistols available. Marking wise, we have Brevetti Giulio Sosso, so patent Sosso, on this side. And then on this side, Fabbrica Nazionale d'Armi Brescia, so that's FNA Brescia. The serial number there is an importer's serial number that wasn't originally on the gun. We've got a number of proof marks up on the front, and our safety selector is right here. Safe, fire, pretty simple. The rear sight on this pistol was a replacement at some point. It's a slightly different style than found on the other examples. So that's what you'll see on the outside. Now the magazine, we have a heel release here, and how's that for a weird looking magazine? Instead of using a follower and spring, what Sosso did was actually put a pivot at the top and the bottom, and has this chain of what really is, they're kind of like belts in a machine gun, or links in a machine gun belt. So each one of these you can snap a cartridge into, and then this whole thing rotates counterclockwise, like so. Now there are some interesting implications to this. It holds 21 rounds. The very first developmental versions in 1934 held 19. By the time this gun was being developed, or being actually produced by FNA, they had increased that to 21. Now that's a very substantial magazine in 1941. Really the only military pistol that came close to that was the high power with 13 round magazines. So that's a cool advantage to this gun. What's interesting to think about are some of the implications of this chain system. For one thing, when you load this, you don't, we're used to regular magazines where no matter how many rounds you load, they all go straight to the top and the first one immediately gets chambered. Well, with this, you could load one round, rotate it a couple of positions, and now you've got it at some random location in the magazine. Just because there's one round doesn't mean it will actually be immediately available like in a regular magazine. This was operated, you can see there's a cutout here in the back. There is a little cam lever arrangement in the pistol that automatically rotates this one position every time the slide cycles. So that's how the gun feeds through this magazine. On the bright side, there are no springs to wear out. I guess the downside is the springs wearing out isn't really that big of a deal in magazines like this. Well, let's take a look at the pistol itself. So I mentioned this is a locked breech pistol, and boy, it's a big, chunky, complicated locked breech pistol. That's what happens when you fire. The slide comes back like so. This is our slide release, except there is a magazine safety in it. So I have to have the magazine in the gun in order to drop the slide, like so. All right, let's take a look at disassembling the pistol. I am going to start by removing the recoil spring, which is actually inside this barrel shroud. So I'm going to take this plunger at the front, push it in, rotate it 90 degrees, and pull it out. This is a system actually fairly similar to a lot of long recoil pistols, although this is not a long recoil action. This is actually a short recoil action. I can then pull out the recoil spring. The nice thing is now I do not have to worry about the slide slamming forward and taking fingers off. Next thing, we're going to pull out the magazine. And then I need to open the slide all the way. And the next step in disassembly is to take off this side plate. There's a disassembly catch right here. Push that down, and then the side plate slides back and lifts off the gun, like so. Now we have pretty good access to the internals. I can also take off this grip plate. Kind of cool, this is actually corrugated sheet metal. These ribs aren't a pattern in the front, they're actually, the entire piece is made out of corrugated metal. So that's just kind of pretty slick. Now, with the side plate off, what I need to do is I need to loosen the barrel. So there's a pin right here that locks the barrel into the frame. It's held in place by the side plate, so it's nice and loose, or it should be. There we go. Flip it over, we can pull this pin out. Now, what I can do is pull the barrel back to here, and then the slide and barrel just lift off. So the slide runs in rails on the side of the gun, but when we take off this side plate, we're taking off the left side rail. That allows the slide to just drop out of the frame. All right, let's look at a couple of specific sub-assemblies in the frame here. First up, we have this guy, which moves up and down. This top peg is captive in the frame right here. There's a slot for it right there. What that does is when the slide goes back, it pulls this up. The slide goes forward, it pushes it down, and that is interacting with these pegs in the cutout of the magazine. So this little tooth right here is what acts to rotate the magazine each time the slide cycles. So if you have gaps in the magazine where you don't have cartridges, every time you cycle the slide, you'll index one position in the magazine. Next up, we have our trigger assembly. So part of that is this lever. This is a magazine safety. Without the magazine in, you can't operate the slide release or the trigger. So when that's there, we then have the trigger assembly. When I pull the trigger, I am pulling this forward. We have an out of battery safety right up here on the top. If this is pushed down, the trigger will not operate. That interacts with this cutout on the back of the slide. So only when the slide is in battery does this tooth have space to move upward. So the gun can only fire when the slide's fully closed. This is a hammer-fired gun, so assuming that the slide is in battery, this yoke presses up into here, trips a sear, releases the hammer. So that part of the design is pretty basic, pretty standard. Now we have another set of weird parts up here in the front of the gun. We have this lug that slides back and forth, and that comes out. In fact, several of these pieces come out when you shake the gun. So this is actually our locking block, believe it or not. And it operates with two of these side plates. These don't have to necessarily be separate parts mechanically, but the way this gun is designed, it's a lot cheaper to make these as separate pieces that then drop into the frame, like so. It's a lot easier to do that than to try and mill those complex surfaces into the frame itself. Now, interacting with those surfaces is this locking block, which sits right there, and it moves about 5 millimeters back and forth. And when it moves forward, the front end lifts up. When it moves back, the front end drops down. All right, let's see if I can explain how this actually works. The barrel is pinned into the frame right here, but you can see we have an oval hole in the barrel. So the barrel can move just slightly back and forward, about 5 millimeters. Put that there. So that's the barrel in its position. It can move about that far. Now, when the slide is in the gun, this surface on the front of the slide is pushing against this, the front surface of the locking block. And this locks the barrel and the slide together. When you fire the gun, recoil starts to accelerate the slide backwards. When the slide moves, it pushes this backward. That pushes the barrel back. When the barrel hits its end of travel, as defined by that pin, this locking block, because it's on a pair of angled surfaces, has dropped. That disengages the barrel from the slide. The barrel stops, and then the slide is able to continue backwards, just moving under the inertia from the recoil of firing. It ejects a cartridge, and then the recoil spring pulls it forward, where it loads a new cartridge, pulls the barrel forward all the way again, which pulls this locking block forward and up, and now the barrel and the slide are locked together again. This is a very complicated system. This would be kind of inordinately expensive to manufacture, and kind of explains why they only made 5 of these, despite giving a gifty, very nice decorative one to the 4 most important people to the Italian military. They were still unable to actually get any contract for any of these guns, which should not be any surprise when you look at how complicated and expensive these are. I mentioned that this is hammer fired. That part of the gun is fairly typical. You can see the back end of the firing pin there. Front, the bolt face right here. We have our typical little tab to pick up a cartridge. We have our extractor there, hole for the firing pin in the center, etc., etc., etc. I do want to take a bit of a closer look at the holster stock here. So this opens up. This is just a leather open holster. Very simple there. Got a tab for closing. When we look at the back, we have a metal frame to it. That keeps everything nice and rigid. This clip is what holds it onto your belt. And then we have a little spring-loaded latch on an extending bar right here. So when you're just using this to carry the gun, this collapses closed so that it's not particularly in the way. When you want to actually use the stock, you depress this lever to unlock it and then extend that bar out to there. The lever locks it in position so that it doesn't collapse on you when you're shooting. And then you have another little locking latch right here that snaps up into the back strap of the gun. So there's the slot in the back strap. This lever here is a heel magazine release, not to be confused with the shoulder stock assembly. This snaps into position just like that. So to release it, you push this in and pull it down. Well, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. It's a very cool opportunity to take a look at an extremely rare Italian pistol here. And really, as far as I know, kind of a one-of-a-kind magazine design and just a really goofy, complicated action. So, cool pistols, very neat. Very big, bulky pistols, too. If you enjoy this sort of work, please consider supporting me on Patreon. My support from folks there at $1 a month really does a lot to help me be able to continue to do this full-time and bring you guys really cool guns like this. Thanks for watching.